This episode of the Police One podcast is sponsored by Officer Store. Learn more about getting the gear you need at prices you can afford by visiting officerstore.com. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Well, we're going to talk about statistics and intelligence and what can we do with them. Well, of course, we've all heard that old quote by Mark Twain or whoever originated it. I know there's several iterations of that saying that says there's three kinds of lies. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Well, of course, he may have also been talking about data collection and analysis. Well, how dependable is our process to gather crime statistics, to analyze them, and turn them into actionable material to base prevention and enforcement efforts? Well, my guest today is Jeff Asher, a former crime analyst for the New Orleans Police Department and founder of AH Datalytics, also a former CIA member, and he's written about crime trends and analysis. Caught my eye. We'll talk in a minute about his homicide analysis, but welcome to Policing Matters, Jeff Asher.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so caught my eye. Tell us about your research and your data reports. Who are they meant for? How are you getting them out?
I write a weekly newsletter, Jeffalytics on Substack, and there's no intended audience per se. The intended audience is whoever wants to read my writing. But the goal being to educate whoever might be interested about not just what the data says, but what are the weak points in it? How do we collect the data? How logical is it? How much does the data back up the conclusions? And how can we sort of use analysis and estimative language to evaluate what it might mean? And so we have that and a fair number of other data projects going that hopefully provide information on what is happening in terms of crime and policing trends in America.
Yeah, so I mean, we've all heard of that acronym GIGO, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And in our national crime statistics gathering, we've gone from the old reliable FBI UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports. We're trying to make this shift over to NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. You came out with a data analysis of national homicide trends in America. And I want to ask you, tell us, I guess when we talk about crime, is crime up or crime down? I think, and you may agree, that one of our best crime statistics that we can measure from year to year is homicides or are homicides, because, I mean, unless you're hiding the bodies somewhere, they're coming up somewhere, somebody's reporting them. What are we talking about in 2024 for homicides in America?
I think that we certainly saw the largest one-year decline ever reported in terms of murder. And the problem with the FBI data, one, is that people assume that there's some sort of precision there. That we talk about the problems of NIBRS, and there's lots of them. But if you go through the history of FBI crime data reporting, it has never been good. There was a period probably from the mid 2000s until 2018 where it was better than normal. But for the most part, you're talking about whole states missing in the 90s, whole states missing in the 80s, prior to the mid to late 70s when state UCR programs started to pop up. You had decades of just anybody reported anything. And so the estimates that the FBI puts out are estimates, and they've always been estimates. So we never have this real precision. The downside is that we take 9 months. The FBI doesn't come out until September, October of this year with its 2024 numbers. So we've got numbers. We're going to put a precise figure on it. It's not going to be 100% precise. And we're going to be, who's going to care what the 2024 figures were in 2025, late 2025. So what we do is we gather data from as many big cities as possible. our target audience is 50,000 or more cities. We're at about 350 cities through December, showing murder down around 16 or 17% this year in that sample. And so that sample might be off by 2-3% maybe, but the largest 1 year decline prior to 2023 was a 9% decline. Right now, the FBI has 2023 at 12% decline. Let's be very conservative and say that our 16.5% decline is really a 13% decline. That's still the largest 1 year decline ever recorded. So I feel decently confident that we saw this enormous drop in 2024. And we won't know for certain until September, October of this year, but we've got the ability to say that based on available data. Project we're working on, Realtime Crime Index, is the project where we gather data from hundreds of cities nationwide. The goal is to get 500 to 1,000 cities or agencies nationwide reporting data, because this is the way that we know our trends quickly, acknowledging that waiting longer doesn't really add a whole ton of precision to it.
Mhm. Yeah, so we know that when we were talking about the homicide stats after 2020, and like you say, 9 months later in 2021, we had an idea of our national homicide rate, but we still had some like really large cities like Chicago and LA who had, and I think New Orleans even, that had not yet reported. So when we're talking about several hundred or thousands of homicides still not in the final data, how do we come up with that conclusion? Are we just extrapolating the data and going off previous years?
So 2021, we stick an asterisk on it. We tell everybody, do not trust these numbers. No matter what story you want to tell, do not use these numbers to do it. If you want to make a graph and you want to use the numbers just in order to have a data point filled in, great, do that. I do that. But do not analyze these numbers. The reason being, the FBI switched to NIBRS. They went from about 90 to 95% of the nation's population covered by a reporting agency to around 65%. And that figure jumped to about 75 to 78% the next year when New Orleans reported old data. And not just New Orleans, but a handful of other cities as well. But those numbers still remain unreliable. There's no Los Angeles, there's New York, there's only 6 months of Chicago. And the way that the FBI estimates missing data is so let's say you're in California, they take all of the cities that look like Los Angeles that did report, so 250,000 or more, and they basically say, okay, Los Angeles has, so the murder rate in those cities was 4.5 per 100,000. And so Los Angeles, we're going to assign a murder rate of 4.5 per 100,000 to Los Angeles and multiply it by Los Angeles's population to estimate what Los Angeles's murder total was. Well, what happened is in California, it was largely just San Diego that reported. So you're basically assigning Los Angeles's crime counts based on San Diego's crime rates, which are significantly lower than Los Angeles's. And so you get this massive undercount using the FBI's estimate procedure. So let's just ignore 2021. By 2022, it was back above 90%. It was up 94% reported data. 2023, it was even higher, 95%, and an even higher percentage reported more complete data. And by 2024, we should be at or above that 95%. So we basically returned to normal by 2022-ish. 2021, not normal, not good, not accurate. Ignore those figures is kind of what we do. And we're now 3 years removed from that, 4 years removed from that. So we can understand our trends saying that, all right, we're just not going to know what happened in 2021, and that's okay.
Okay. Well, I could see so many problems with that formula that you just described. I mean, Oakland is 7 miles across a bridge from San Francisco mild department, and San Francisco has averaged for several years with a couple spikes, 50 homicides for a population of about 850,000. Across the bridge, Oakland at half the population, 420,000 maybe, averages about 100 homicides a year. So again, with some dips in between. But I mean, just saying that in the region we're going to settle on 50 is a way different than if we're going to settle on 100 for those similar populations, because San Francisco is pretty close to the national average of about 6 to 7-ish per 100,000, and Oakland is always in that 24 per 100,000 sort of area. So who are we relying on, or what? Tell me the URL or the website where we go for the best data, if not the FBI UCR.
Well, realtimecrimeindex.com is the website that we've built. And there you can see the trend as it develops, and we update it with about a 45-day lag. So next week, not exactly sure when this will go to air, but mid-February, we'll publish the December data. And the reason that we do that is it gives agencies a month to catch up. So if you're reporting your January data on February 1st, you're probably not reporting all of your January data. You might not have the 30th and the 31st reports fully written. So if we give you an extra month, it means that you basically fulfilled your January reporting by the middle of March. And
Mm,
many agencies have until the 15th of the month to report. So we kind of, that's as fast as we can go with still being accurate, acknowledging that we're still going to update historical data to match what agencies are reporting, so that we're not developing some sort of massive underreporting. So we're not systemically underreporting what the agencies actually are saying.
hmm. And so we both mentioned NIBRS, and the promise of NIBRS was that we were going to get so many more dimensions to crime so that we could act on it, either in a prevention means or in an enforcement means. We talk about the idea of, the crime triangle. We're going to enhance what we know about victimology. We're going to enhance what we know about the offenders, the types of tools, the types of weapons, what they were doing before, what their motivations were, all of that. And then the location, where we've had some really awesome people on the podcast talking about location-based violence, location-based crime, and how that really plays a part in an agency's or a jurisdiction's focus on addressing crime. So you said there's so many problems with NIBRS. What's going on there?
So the NIBRS transition has been slower, I think, than people expected. Um, it's become much more of a small town, small agency problem.
Hmm.
The New York is NIBRS compliant now. Los Angeles is, in theory, getting close. Um, the most of the places that aren't NIBRS compliant are smaller agencies where there's a large cost to doing it. It's very disruptive, and the feds, if they didn't do it in the last decade, the feds aren't paying for it now. So it's something that I think is very difficult. NIBRS allows you to do a lot of cool stuff. Now that we're 4 years past the transition, and we've reached the point where 80+% of the nation's population is covered by NIBRS, there's a lot of cool stuff. You can look at vehicle burglaries where a firearm was stolen. You can look at carjackings. Eventually, we're going to have shooting data in there. There's lots of good things that you can do with NIBRS data. I think that the most promising thing that nobody talks about with NIBRS, because it's very much in the weeds, is that it has forced all of these agencies in making the transition, and all of these states to transition from what's called flat file, where every month you send in, all of your data. The agency has to go through basically a spreadsheet, fix it all, and send it back and get it fixed. And it takes a long time for that data to work, to XML transition, which can be instantaneous. It's very easy for the agencies in the states to set up audit procedures. You're still going to have errors, but they can get fixed much quicker. And what this has allowed is a number of states, I think we're up to 15 states, that just publish their data as it comes in.
Hmm.
And this basically means that when we go get data, we can get it at the exact quality that the agencies in the states are sending to the FBI in much faster time, because it's basically just, it's publicly available now. It's not, you don't have victim names or any sort of personal identifying information, but there's tons of data there. And so if you want to talk a faster crime system, getting every agency to be XML compliant and every state to start publishing the data as it comes in, that's the way to go. And NIBRS allows that in a way that SRS and the old system didn't.
Yeah, so we're getting closer to real-time crime reporting and real-time crime reaction. I want to ask you about taking that data and, being, I guess our history in America has always been that we do have some collection points for data and we have the ability to analyze it, but we've fallen down so many, there's so many examples. I mean, you just wrote that great Substack article that referred to World War II, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and that kind of data that we had that was pretty real and pretty actionable, and yet we know what happened. But first, I want to take a moment and thank our sponsor. We'll be right back.
Officer Store, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at officerstore.com.
And we're back, and I'm speaking with Jeff Asher, crime data analyst and founder of AH Datalytics. And I gave a little bit of a hint before the break, Jeff, talking about your Substack article, and you talked about all the things that the U.S. military had in place in Pearl Harbor before the attack. What happened there?
So I can't remember exactly where I read it, but I read somewhere, and I wish I had the original source, that basically the Japanese plan, if they were detected before launching, was to basically message back banzai, turn around, and go home. So the attack would have been very easily disrupted if it had been discovered in any way. And if you look at the various means of failure, it wasn't one failure, it was several layers of failure. And so I separated it into the tactical, the strategic, and the institutional. With the tactical being that there were X number of reconnaissance aircraft that had they launched them, and I know they didn't have enough aircraft for 24/7 coverage. It would have taken divine luck in order to spot the Japanese at the exact time they were there, but they had some assets in place that could have done that. Mini subs, Japanese submarines were detected well before the attack. The attack was detected on radar, but it wasn't communicated effectively that's what that was. It wasn't known that that's what that was. So those were the tactical failures. When we think about Pearl Harbor, and basically when we punished Pearl Harbor as from the national investigation, that was what we punished. You can look at the bigger strategic failures, which were basically, and a lot of times this is what we think of the failure to connect the dots from an intel perspective. Lots of clues that the Japanese were planning something diplomatically, other clues in sort of a bigger picture that's not just the people on the ground that didn't spot it. Those we talk about a little bit, but the biggest ones are really the institutional failures, that the institutions were not set up. The Army and the Navy intelligence did not talk. The code breakers in Hawaii did not have access to the raw intercepts and the ability to decrypt them, that because they had sent the machine to London, the intercept machine, as a gift, rather than so they had one in Washington, and they didn't have one in Pearl Harbor. So that very talented team that basically won the Battle of Midway did not have access to the raw intercepts and the ability to use them. Other big picture things, and this is probably more in the strategic, they sent out a war warning. This is a war warning, very clear. In late November 1941, it didn't include Pearl Harbor as one of the places that needed to be aware that something was up. I think the assumption was that they know that Pearl Harbor is a target, but if you're not saying that, then it suggests that you have some information and maybe there's no need to be incredibly defensive. So all of these things, these layers of intel failure, that basically the tactical is what we look at the most. The institutional is what basically sets the ground with which the tactical happens. And so if you look at more modern ones, and so all of this was I talked about in light of the Bourbon Street attack on January 1st of this year, where the tactical failures are the policing ones. We talk about the police department, the bollards, the wedges, the one car, the strategic failures, federal. That I'm not saying that this guy was on anybody's radar or anything, but like a person flew to Egypt. He became radicalized, self-radicalized, and then he killed a whole bunch of Americans. That is, whether or not they had evidence, whether or not there were puzzle pieces to put together or not, that's a failure to detect this person. But the institutional ones are the ones that I think are the most interesting, and those are the ones that basically allowed all of the tactical ones. There's nothing that the city can do about the feds, but the city and the state basically were set up in a way that they were not preparing. And so NOPD put the bollards, didn't use the bollards because the bollards didn't work. We've known since 2019 that the bollards don't work. They didn't use a wedge because the main priority was in trying to get somebody out of Bourbon. If you have a medical emergency inside of Bourbon Street, these wedges, they don't go up and down very well. And they only had a single car because that's probably what they did. And so they had all of this this planning in place years ago, and it had basically fallen apart. And if the police department was not doing what it was supposed to, they're in charge of deploying the assets. They're not the ones that are in charge of the planning and that process. And so the failure was one of recognizing that this was an issue. It had been years since the bollards were known to not work. 3 years or 2.5 years since they actually removed the bollards completely. They hadn't replaced them, and the ones they were going to replace them with were not rated to take on a truck. They were rated at like the lowest possible level. They were like basically cones. So you've got a situation where yes, we talk about the policing failures. The policing failures, the tactical failures are obvious, but none of that exists without the institutional failures that allowed it to fester. And this guy had come to New Orleans twice. He had clearly looked at the area. There is a very obvious situation in which some of the tactical failures had been lessened and something else horrific had happened. A mass shooting from a balcony, something else that he had even looked at, or maybe he goes to somewhere else on Mardi Gras. I don't know what it is. And so, yes, we can fix the tactical failures. You looked at what they did with the Super Bowl. It was nothing but security in the French Quarter. But when we aren't in Super Bowl mode, have we fixed the institutional failures that will allow us to not have these tactical failures? That's, I think, the bigger question, the bigger issue raised by all of this. I don't think the city's addressed it at all, but I think that the first step is sort of building out the attention to the issue and then hopefully trying to fix it.
Yeah, so I mean, in everyday life, it's hard to just have that situational awareness where we're looking at all the different possibilities of threats. But when we have a big event coming up in our city, whether it's a planned sporting event or celebration or an annual event like New Year's Eve or St. Patrick's Day, we should be looking, or maybe even a presidential visit, that we are looking at our intel, we are mapping out the paths, the routes, the high positions, and all of these things, and taking them into account. Are we doing a better job? I mean, it's hard to say we are these days. I mean, we can go back 25 years to 9/11, and we know that, again, after the fact, and I hate sitting here being the Monday morning quarterback, but we're looking at what led up to 9/11, and we saw there were some precursor events and information that we could have acted on. What's the holdup? Is it that, especially in today's age, are we just getting bombarded with information? We talk about silos between the feds and the local law enforcement. How, what's the answer? Is AI the answer in taking this data and giving it to us in a more condensed form?
No, I don't know that there's an answer, and I think that there's a tendency to look at today as like, the worst it's ever been. There's failures in the 80s, failures in the 70s, failures in the 60s. The failure is not new because it's always going to happen. But are you improving your processes, improving your ability to look internally and fix your own problems? You know, I'd argue that in the aftermath of 9/11 and the terrible WMD national intelligence estimate that was used as a justification for invading Iraq, um, the the intel community looked inward, and this was something that I was hired a few years after that. A big part of it was recognizing these failures, and when I took my training, it was how do we do wrong and how do we do better about it. I think that part of the challenge is, and maybe I don't think this is new, but it certainly it feels worse, is that government takes any effort to acknowledge that this was not right. We did things wrong, as some sort of personal affront and not a this was not great. We can do better. Look at policymakers after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was not a well done policy implementation, and yet policymakers are talking about how, like, it went great. This we did the best we could, and I don't know that that's true. And not just to pick on the recent Biden administration, you could find it under every presidential administration, things that went wrong and things that went right. If policymakers are too blinded by their need to be always right, then they're never going to learn from when they were wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to do debriefings to make ourselves look inward and do better. And I mean, if we're talking just like the recent last 12 months, during the presidential campaign, with all of the real-time crime centers and all of the technology and drone abilities, how is it that we don't secure a perimeter rooftop? I mean, I know we had people on the ground guarding these buildings, but what happened to a drone capability? And I don't want to get into that particular instance, but have we seen an after action report that addressed all of that? And
Not that I'm
are
aware of. I don't.
are we going to?
I would doubt that we would see anything publicly that would identify methods and capabilities of things like the Secret Service. I think, you look at something like Bourbon Street attack, you've got like at least 4 different entities that I can think of that are investigating it. So you've got Congress, the state, the DAA, and the council. And so and probably the FBI. So all of these issues, I think the key is in learning lessons that are helpful from failure, and that's where analyzing things like I do comes in. I try to be neutral, and I think my writing was once called pithy, which I took as a compliment. I'm not putting emotion in there. I have my biases just like everybody else does, but can't let your biases affect your analysis. As best you can, speak the truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. They're on the CIA lobby, so that's sort of a speak truth to power is definitely a means of approaching analysis that I think we need more of in this world.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, getting back to crime and a national threat. So we have our overdose rate climbing well over 100,000 now. We've just seen in the past 20 years, they've gone from 20,000 overdose deaths to over 100, I think 110 last year, 1,000 overdose deaths. We've used intelligence to see that the chemicals are coming mainly from China up through our southern border, where it's mixed, packaged, and brought up into America. How do we use that intel to come up with a good plan to thwart that?
That's a good question. That's not one that I typically deal with. I know that there's expertise out there. My understanding is we've kind of peaked and are hopefully starting to fall. But it's a real challenge because we know that the certainty and swiftness of getting caught is the greatest deterrent. And we know that things like the war on drugs don't work. You're going to lose if that is your approach. So I think that it's a very difficult thing where, yes, there is a policing component, but it's not strictly a policing response. And I think policymakers at all levels tend to struggle when that is kind of like gun violence. Like, yes, there is a policing response to approaching gun violence, but there's more to it than that. And I think that finding the right balance and finding policies that work is the key. And we're not very good at finding and sticking with policies that work, regardless of political biases.
Yeah. So, but here's my view on that. So we do everything we can to grab all the data, analyze it, come up with a plan, and we've not done a good one. I mean, nobody wanted, like you just said, the war on drugs. So law enforcement turned it over to public health. They went with harm reduction, and it just blew up. It went out of control. But now, like you said, we're starting to see it come down a little bit. But isn't it a good time to use that data analysis to find out what we did right? Or are we just so happy that something happened, we don't know what, that's reducing the overdose deaths? And there's so many different, there's so much speculation that maybe it is better enforcement, maybe it is strengthening the border, or maybe it really just comes down to dealers saying, it is not a great business strategy to kill our customers because eventually we're going to run out of customers. So, we've heard rumors that cartels are reducing the strength, reducing the amount of fentanyl in whatever it is they're selling. So, wouldn't it be great to do a data analysis to find out what we did right and then just like put the foot to the pedal on that strategy and make it even better?
Yeah, I mean that's every strategy, every policy that we want. We're not good at the measurement angle. We don't know what works in a lot of angles, and so it oftentimes will become what are the activists yelling about the loudest, and sometimes those are not terrible ideas. Sometimes they are terrible ideas, and so I think it makes it very difficult when you have loud activists bringing policymakers along to say, well, actually, this is not the best idea.
Yeah, so you're CIA trained, you've got your own data analytics company, you're coming out with real-time data, and what about the action? Are you making any recommendations based on what you're seeing? Are you hearing from law enforcement agencies who say, hey, give us more? We need, this is a great trail that we're going down with your data and we're actually disrupting crime? Are you seeing those kinds of results?
Not usually from the policing end. The police departments are more the suppliers of the data than the receivers. Hopefully, it's useful for them in order to contextualize their changes versus the rest of the country. We're not a policy recommendation arm. We don't. I'm not here to tell people like, hey, auto theft is up. Let's fix that. Hopefully, the just calling the balls and the strikes is sufficient, and we don't really have anybody that's putting together and telling everybody what the picture looks like. And so really our job is to tell people what the picture looks like, to do it in an honest way that's trustworthy, and hopefully will then contribute to people creating better policy.
Yeah, well, hopefully, on the national front, somebody gets involved in taking that data and making it actionable. And I teach a crime and data class at my university. And one of my projects that I give to the students is to come up with a crime map, 30-day crime map from any law enforcement agency in America, and then do an overlay, look deeper than the crime pattern. So one crime, 30 days, try to find a pattern. And a lot of times, and we've seen it with the Boston Operation Ceasefire, that they did an overlay of these young people being shot in Boston with an overlay of where the gangs were. Duh, right? So that's, for me, a visual person, I think that's a great representation to connect those dots, right? And I've seen other students come up with plans that showed that, these types of thefts from person, whether it's a pickpocket or a strong arm robbery, that they align perfectly with these public transit routes and things like that. So I think, the ability to make those connections is there. I just wish that, except for agencies doing it, agency by agency, that there was more strategy involved. And like I said, we've talked to some great experts at DOJ and University of Las Vegas, Reno, Las Vegas. I'm trying to think of the professor's name that's come out with these great reports, and they really talk about every city knows, and from New Orleans, working and living in New Orleans, that those 10 hotspots in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
So match the crime data over those hotspots and make the real connections, and let's follow up. We're hearing resistance from those people that you just talked about, the people that are anti-AI, who say that it's a formula that's unfair. I don't know how analytics can be unfair, but they talk about the bias in analytics and the bias in crime apps as well.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that, and my approach is that there's all sorts of ways that we know that gun violence is sticky. There's all sorts of ways that you can identify what risk looks like, both geographically and person-based. Most of that requires access to policing data. The police have records of who's been shot and who's been arrested for shootings and things like that. So if you want to treat gun violence like a disease and you want to attack the problem, there's no way to get around it without using policing data. But just because you're using policing data doesn't mean that all of your solutions have to be policing specific. So there are ways to identify people that are at high risk, to deliver services, deliver programming. There are also ways that police can investigate shootings, solve a higher degree than 20-30% of shootings, solve a higher degree than 40% of murders, prevent retribution killings, interrupt that cycle of violence. These things all have to talk together. There's not an either or in my mind. And so I think it starts with policing data and better access to policing data, and it ends with more comprehensive programs and policies to attack the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. How can people find out about where you are, where to find the Realtime Crime Index.com and your Substack?
There it is, realtimecrimeindex.com. My Substack, jasher.substack.com. I come out usually every Monday. So sometimes if I'm waiting on FBI data or something, I'll wait till Tuesday or Wednesday to publish. But for the most part, I try and do one a week and I started almost more than 2 years ago. So yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And it's Professor Harold, of course, Tamara Harold from University of Reno, Las Vegas, and working up in Washington, D.C. now, coming out with that the great stuff on place-based violence and place-based crime. And I think coupled with kind of the data that you're putting out, that's a great start for a law enforcement agency to look at where crime's happening in their region, as well as their city, and use it to come up with some good plans. Hey, thanks so much, Jeff Asher, crime data analyst and founder of AH Datalytics. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
All right. Hey, to our listeners and our viewers, I want to thank you, and I hope everybody is good, and I appreciate you checking in with us today. Let me know what you think. Drop me a line at policingmatters@police1.com, policingmatters@police1.com, and let me know what you think. All right, stay safe, take good care, and hope to talk to you again real soon.